Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Margaret Thatcher did it after the Falklands, George Bush after Iraq, and even David Cameron after Libya. Leaders who've gambled on a war and won, however illusory that victory might turn out to be, can rarely resist the telling photo opportunity. So the sight of the Russian president hugging the once apparently doomed Syrian leader today in Syria told its own particularly extraordinary story. In the Vietnam War, an American officer was once quoted as saying he needed to destroy a town to save it. Well, you could say the same of this entire war. Hundreds of thousands dead, whole cities reduced to nothing but rubble. And at the end of it all, a lethal, despised dictator back where most believe he has never belonged. Mr. Putin himself congratulated Russian troops on their triumph over terrorists. Mission accomplished, he said, or words to that effect, as he announced a partial pullout. But what does it mean for the rest of us?
Vladimir Putin's surprise visit to Syria was about celebrating Russia's decisive intervention in the war. Flanked by Russian jet fighters as he was filmed approaching the Am airbase, Vladimir Putin could afford himself a wry and satisfied grin. As he got off the plane, he was met by Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, but there was no mistaking who was the star of the show here. He then addressed the assembled Russian troops. "Hello, comrades," he said to them. Everything was carefully choreographed with one aim: to announce Russia's arrival as a major force in a Middle East long dominated by Washington. He told Russian troops that they'd been tasked with fighting militia groups in Syria and that they had achieved it brilliantly, and it was now time for them to come home. Rasmus Nielsen is an expert in Russian foreign and security policy.
It's an important moment in the sense that, I mean, as people have said before, this is really where Russia marks itself in the Middle East, marks itself as a player, if you like. And that's, of course, one of the elements you'd expect from a so-called great power, which is what the Russian regime has been mentioning time and again that they are.
But it's been achieved at a terrible cost to Syrians. Russian air power undoubtedly saved Assad's regime from collapse. But it's also meant that the millions of Syrians living in refugee camps have no way of returning, with so many cities reduced to ruins. Nowhere more so than the city of Aleppo, which lies utterly ruined and empty of its people. Russia also protected the Syrian regime from being held accountable for some of its worst crimes, like its use of chemical weapons against opponents in 2013, by vetoing attempts to get the UN to investigate. Today, at times, it was hard to tell who was hosting who. Even though Vladimir Putin was visiting Syria, it was President Assad who looked like the invited guest. Putin entered the Syrian war with clear, strict aims, and he's achieved them ruthlessly. In doing so, he's expanded Russian power in yet another vital part of the world.
And Raggy is here with me now. Raggy, I mean, it seems amazing, really, to be watching that after everything we've reported on over these past few years. But look, they've destabilised the West. They're on the march in their own sphere of influence. It's the story of our times, really, one of them, isn't it?
It is. I mean, I suppose it's as I was saying there, a ruthless pursuit of power where others have rescinded their influence. And I think that's the story of the Middle East. I mean, Russia's story of the last century and a half has been to get what it's called a warm water port. It's now got two bases in the Mediterranean in Syria, the Am Air base and Tartus, which is the naval base. Of course, it's, you know, alleged meddling in elections from our own here, potentially, to the United States is, again, a semblance of a ruthless pursuit of
causing a lot of trouble, regardless of whether it's actually
But also,
children.
it's placing Russian influence in places that they've never really had before. I think that's the arc of the sort of narrative here, and the one that really spells out in Syria. I would say, though, in the Middle East, I mean, they're withdrawing their troops. They're not a long-term player. You can't see what the long-term Russian plan is in the Middle East. And if there was to be a different administration with a different view of the Middle East, then it might be back to sort of, you know, game as usual in the Middle East. But at the moment, Russia is in the ascendancy there.
And then there's no doubt Assad survived this war, in brief.
I think so. I mean, it doesn't mean an end to the war, but I can't see who's going to sort of challenge him.
OK. Would once have been extraordinary. Raghi, thank you very much indeed.
I've been getting